That's another reason why they have never become this very sophisticated criminal organization, because they're really bad criminals. Uh, I mean, it comes down to that. And if you are managing a very sophisticated criminal organization, why would you align yourself with them? They're totally visible. They fall on the radar of law enforcement nonstop. They're all tattooed up and they're really bad at what they do. And there's so many possible leaks of information. And it just doesn't make sense on so many levels to align yourself with them.
How do you describe what you do for work?
I would say I find human stories about organized crime and corruption, mostly in the Americas where I live. And I try and tell those human stories to illustrate institutional or systematic problems that we face as societies, as countries. For me, the most exciting thing is getting to and telling those human stories. That's the part that gets me up in the morning. And that's what I spend most of my time doing. So a lot of it is kind of finding these people, getting them to talk to you, and then reconstructing their stories, hopefully in the most accurate way possible. We as humans are incredibly complex. We're gray. There's no black and white. So that's what I aim to tell, is that gray area. I love that gray area.
That's where the interesting stuff is.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm a specialist in the gray area.
Yeah, I get that. You've been focused on MS-13 for quite a while now. What is MS-13?
MS-13 is a gang that was born really from refugees that were fleeing a civil conflict in El Salvador and other parts of Central America eventually in the 1980s. And they landed in spaces like Los Angeles, in the deep heart of Los Angeles, and found themselves in the midst of hundreds of street gangs. And they formed one of their own. Initially, it's a gang that is grouped together, or at least their sort of common bond was initially heavy metal music, of all things. So that's, I guess, innocent enough. And that evolved for a lot of reasons, perhaps most of all because of the environment in which they were living. And it became this international or transnational gang over the last 40 years. It is an incredibly notorious gang, even if it's not the most violent, mostly because of these very gruesome ways in which they go after and often kill their rivals or perceived rivals. They use blunt instruments like machetes, knives, those sorts of things, and they kill in groups. So they act as a group, and they often kill in numbers. So, 3 to 4 victims, what would be considered sort of a massacre in international standards, those sorts of things, and very often in public. So they have this, fearsome reputation, but they're really kind of they're a haphazard, loosely knit network. They're grouped under this umbrella, the MS-13, but they're linked. They're more linked, more closely connected to what are called cliques, or their sort of personal cells where they grew up. So it's a very, while it's international, most of their activities are very much local. So that's where it comes from. And then the fascination around them comes from just mostly, I would say, this gruesome way in which they go after their rivals or perceived rivals.
Do they have a leader?
They have leaders. Each of the cliques that I mentioned has a leader. Underneath, or I should say above the cliques, they have what are called programs, and those group a number of cliques. And there are probably in the range of 35 or 40 programs, and this is in a half dozen countries now, mostly in the Americas, but they are popping up now in Europe. And then above them, they have leadership, kinds of boards of directors, really, that work kind of geographically speaking. So you have a board of directors, or what they call a mesa, or a table of directors in LA. You have another one, which is probably the most powerful one, in El Salvador. It's known as the Ramfla. They call it the Ramfla Histórica, which means quite literally the translation would be historical wheel. Ramfla is wheel. It goes back to their origins in LA, where there is a fascination with cars, right? And you'll think of the very cliched cars bouncing up and down. Yeah, that's the Ramfla, right? Let's get the Ramfla, right? So they take that and it's transformed in it's referred to as the wheel or the leadership circle. And Histórica is historical. So this is the traditional leadership. That's probably the most powerful board of directors that the MS-13 has, but no one part of the gang has complete control over the other parts of the gang. And that's the thing that's very hard for people to wrap their heads around. There isn't like one single
there's no
leader.
El Chapo, there's no...
There's no one single leader moving these guys around like chess pieces. Very common misperception about what the gang is. It's very loosely knit network, and they are mostly loyal to their cliques and their clique leaders, in particular the person who administered their beating in. So they have rituals to enter into the gang, and one of them is this sort of beat-in ceremony that lasts, well, they say 13 seconds, but that's a long 13 seconds that they're counting away while a bunch of guys are beating up this guy who's going to be initiated or who is being initiated. And their loyalty then is to the person who administered that very often. So it's a very, very sort of difficult thing, again, to wrap our hands around.
What's it got to do with the Mexican Mafia? There's affiliations there as well, isn't there?
The Mexican Mafia is this sort of prison gang, is a prison-based gang, mostly run out of Southern California state prisons. And what they understood as a kind of gang very early on was that if they controlled the prison systems, in particular the Latinos inside the prison system, they could set up and extend their network beyond the prison walls themselves. So beginning really going back to the 1950s and 1960s, they established a firm control over the Latinos inside the U.S. prison system. Why is that important? Well, in the United States, the prisons are really divided along racial lines. And so it's basically brown versus black versus white in the crudest sense of understanding how it works there. And so the Mexican Mafia, which I know that you've spoken about in other shows of yours, was able to sort of corral all the Latinos underneath an umbrella group they call the Sureños. And at a certain point, they not only sort of, would take people who came in, but they began to force all of the Southern California Latino gangs to become part of that umbrella group, the Sureños. And that was the case with the MS-13. They were essentially forced into this umbrella group, the Sureños. So they're part of this Mexican Mafia umbrella group, which gives the Mexican Mafia this sort of control and leverage over the comings and goings of all of these street gangs operating in Southern California and beyond. And they can use these networks for themselves so they can make money. And they do make loads of money. As you well know, the Mexican Mafia is a very, they're sort of a member of the Mexican Mafia. It's anywhere between 100 and 130 members. So very small compared to these street gangs like the MS-13 that have thousands and thousands of members. What do they care, right? This is just contract labor for them. So they're able to, in essence, sort of extend their criminal networks via these gangs like the MS-13.
I suppose if you're in jail and the choice is between striking out on your own or finding a partnership with your people, if the Mexican Mafia if it's a choice between those two, why would you try and splinter off on your own? The whites aren't going to have you, the blacks aren't going to have you, presumably. So you've got to go with those people. Going back to El Salvador, is it right that there's about a murder a minute in El Salvador and it's got a population that's less than London?
Not currently. It has gone down considerably since your murder a minute statistic probably came out. there was a time in which it hovered around 100 murders per 100,000, which would far surpass whatever London's is, which I would imagine is maybe even one or below that per 100,000. So, 100 times at any point, it was 100 times more. You're more likely to be murdered in El Salvador than you were in London. So yes, in that regard, it has gone down considerably. And there is a lot of debate about why it's gone down. And one of the theories around why it's gone down is because of an alleged pact between the current government and mostly, in this case, because the MS-13 isn't the only gang there, but mostly the MS-13 because it is the most powerful gang in El Salvador. And what does this pact entail? It entails a trade-off where the gang says we're going to lower homicides. At least we're going to make it so you don't find nearly as many bodies. So disappearances, forced disappearances, by the way, are going way up. And the murder rate goes down. This is politically advantageous because we on the outside, what do? We use murder rate as a proxy for evaluating how a country is doing on security matters. It's probably not a fair proxy, but that's the proxy we use. So that goes down. Great. So, foreign direct investment and all the other things that come along, accolades and look at you're solving the gang problem. All of that comes with it. Right. And in return, what does the government do? It gives them, sort of special visiting rights and privileges inside of prisons, to their loved ones and others, including reported by some, not necessarily by us. And I work for Insight Crime, which is a think tank that covers these matters. It includes this sort of, maybe quid pro quos of trading off certain things inside the prisons, including having meetings or brokering meetings of guys from the outside on the inside so they can continue to do business. Visitation rights for family members, as that is super important. And then also their ability to control the administration of special assistance, and especially during this time of COVID, in the neighborhoods that they control. So in other words, you have a government program that is providing special assistance to people in need during the pandemic. Who administers that? Who hands out that assistance? What we understand is that gang members begin to control that assistance. So what does that give them? That gives them a huge amount of capital and clout in those communities where they operate. So you can see how this quid pro quo operates. I guess the last thing and arguably super important thing, especially from the political perspective, is that they open up the door for political parties, the principal political party run by the president, to campaign in their areas under their control, and they prohibit the other campaigns from going in their areas under their control. So how do you campaign? How do you do a political campaign? This worked very much in the favor of the government, who ended up winning the midterm elections and now controls Congress by a healthy margin. And it looks as if they might even change the Constitution so the president can stay on for years and years. So you can see how this can have real effects. Wow.
I can't believe that what they gave the government was, we'll make the bodies disappear. We can't promise anything about the murders, but the bodies, there'll be fewer bodies around, and that's ended up. Yeah, it really does feel like they've got their fingers into absolutely everything. What is it that they want? Do they have a mission? Obviously, when you look back to kind of the classic, the Mexican cartels and stuff like that, there was this vision of riches and drugs and kind of conquering and controlling territory. What's the equivalent for MS-13? What's their goal?
Yeah, they don't have a goal. I mean, they are very much, for the most part, up until now, and we're talking about sort of a 40-year history where mostly it has been a rudimentary hand-to-mouth existence. It is about the here and now, about sort of living the day. And part of that, and this is what I've learned now 10 years, investigating this and talking to gang members, is the social aspect. I think we really downplay the social part of the gang. We put the criminal aspect first. We talk about them as a cartel, or they have this money-making machine as it relates to extortion, or maybe they're involved in human smuggling or prostitution rings, or whatever the case may be. We put the sort of cart before the horse, I think, in that we put the criminal economy in front and we say, this is what drives them. No, I don't think so. I think what drives them is their social cohesion and their bonds with one another and their relationship with one another. They are not a rich organization. This isn't a huge money-making operation. Now, there are elements of the gang that are showing signs of changing this in terms of getting involved in increasingly sophisticated drug trafficking activities. But these are very small elements within, we're talking about the MS-13 umbrella. We're talking about anywhere between 50,000 and 100,000 members across, 6 different countries. And we're talking about, just a few dozen getting involved in these more sophisticated activities. Because most of the others, while they may be making a lot of money in, for example, extortion, and they are, that's parceled out through many, many, many hands, through all of these thousands of hands and their family members, and others who they have to pay off along the way in order to do these criminal activities. So we can talk about them making, in the millions of dollars, but that is spread out among many hands. And to be honest, again, going back to the most important point for me is they are a social organization first. Maybe we want to call them antisocial in many respects, but they're social. It's a community. We don't want to think of it that way, but it is a community first, a social community first, a criminal organization second, to the point where in our investigations, what we found and what I've found in my own investigations are that these members who become very good, very entrepreneurial in what they're doing, for example, in drug trafficking, they are literally pushed aside. They're pushed out of the organization. And they don't even use the organization in many respects to do these sophisticated criminal activities because they know that that's not what the organization is built for. That's not what the MS-13 is built for. So it's very hard for us to wrap our heads around this because, and this is where I started as well. I started by looking at it as a criminal organization. I was looking at it, what are their criminal activities? That's what drives them, right? No, that's not what drives them.
That's interesting. I wonder whether the classic South American drug cartel, mafia style approach that's kind of embedded in the back of our brains, I wonder whether that's washing them and we always look, okay, so what's the commercial enterprise here? What's the game that they're playing? Are they running rackets like the New York Mafia? Are they in the concrete game? Are they in the drug game? Are they in the people trafficking game? That's the interesting thing about MS-13. I think you call them this hand-to-mouth organization that, for want of a better word, they don't sound tremendously sophisticated. Like a poorly funded, poorly organized version of other cartels that have come before them. I don't know how I feel about that. I wonder whether it makes it feel a little bit more desperate. In a way, it makes it feel less bourgeois and kind of like they had a choice. It certainly feels like if they're doing this because they need the social cohesion, that it's there for the purpose feels more human, but that also makes the killing and the violence seem more wanton. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And these are that's sort of a central paradox in all this. You really hit a central paradox with the MS-13 is that they are victims in a certain way. And they are victimizers. They embody both of these things constantly. We can pick out the victim side and we can pick out the victimizing side and we can highlight whichever one we want at the time that most suits us. They do commit horrendous acts of violence. My argument would be that those horrendous acts of violence are part of the way in which they create this group cohesion. They're not even part of what they're doing as a means of establishing control over a criminal.
It's almost economy. Purposeless, isn't it?
You think of it as purposeless in the sense of your rational economic mind.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
but it's totally purposeful when you think about it in your social mind.
Cohesion, binding them together as a group,
Yes.
shared sacrifice.
Illustrating my commitment and shared sacrifice, because that's what I'm about. That's the most important element. So if you look at the cases against them are all cases of assault and murder. And, there are some cases of sophisticated activities, sophisticated meaning the most sophisticated they get are, and this just came up in an indictment about 6 months ago in the United States, was moving 100, I believe it was, I want to say 100 tons of marijuana. That was the most, not 100 tons, sorry, 100 pounds of marijuana. This is
it's
like
fairly low level stuff when you're thinking about the grand scheme of cartels.
It's not a cartel. Exactly. It's just not, they just don't get there. And when the guys who do start to get there, what they do is they liaise with the guys like the Mexican Mafia. They start to interact with them. They are trying their best to get accepted into the Mexican Mafia. The 6 or 7 cases that at Inside Crime that we've chronicled over the years that illustrate these international drug trafficking schemes, commandeered by leaders of the MS-13, they're almost invariably connecting with and working with the Mexican Mafia, not with their own gang.
So they need to outsource to a more sophisticated business unit, because within their own gang, they don't have any of the people that are of this sort of commercial, entrepreneurial, enterprising mind. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I can't work that out. I read about murder, rape, control being some sort of tagline. What's that about?
I mean, there's a lot of myths. I don't know whether to call this a myth, but there's a lot of stories that I think in part are promoted, by the gang as things that are part and parcel of the gang. This is kind of one of them, like I think it's just part of a gang trying to burnish its reputation as being extremely strong and vicious and ruthless. Because I have never, and I have interviewed dozens of these guys, not one of them has ever spontaneously talked like that to me. Has spontaneously said, oh yeah, our motto is, this, and that is not how it works. So I sometimes think that these things got picked up and then they just they kind of take on a life of their own. I think this is probably one of them.
Yeah. A little bit of artistic license, like you might use to embellish the features of a product. The features of their product are their scariness and their viciousness.
And it helps them. It helps prosecutors. It helps police departments get more resources. It helps politicians get elected. I mean, it is a win-win-win-win situation with these kind of, these little teeny myths that kind of percolate about these organizations. I think just one more thing, going back to the social aspect that I think we have to keep in mind, is that it makes them, in the long haul, I think it has made them more resilient to law enforcement efforts. Because if you are simply thinking that you're going to take away their criminal economy, and you are going to thus remove their sort of core element of being, you're sorely mistaken. In fact, by throwing them in jail, you are just reinforcing this social cohesion, which is what happens over and over, and why they were able to basically replicate the Mexican Mafia style when they moved their operations to El Salvador and other places in Central America.
I suppose they're kind of like Bitcoin. They're such a decentralized structure. They don't have one single operator structurally in terms of the way that the hierarchy is ordered, and their earning potential is also done in that same way. There isn't some great river with tributaries coming off it that everybody's feeding on. It's all just little rackets here and there. It's making the bus driver pay. There was like a bus driver's strike or something because they were threatening the bus drivers that they needed to pay them. Then there's bus drivers dead in the street and stuff like this. So yeah, I suppose as being resilient as a gang goes, staying poor is actually quite an easy way to do that, because there isn't one single income stream that can be chopped away. When it comes to who they're recruiting, where are they getting their members? Who are they recruiting?
I think they're recruiting where gangs recruit. Youth in the neighborhood, at the schools, playing
So
soccer.
you're talking like children.
Yes, absolutely. They are the members. Those who become members talk about their first interactions with the gang, when they are toddlers. And because the gang is around, right? It's just another element that is around. That could be part of their house. It could be part of their neighborhood, could be part of their school. And so the gang is there. It's sort of around. And in many places, these are the coolest kids. I mean, they have access to the coolest toys, the best music, the marijuana. It's not too different from what draws us as youth to any crowd. So I don't think it's necessarily that different in that respect. I think in other respects, it can be very different in the sense that I may join the gang just to be safe or think that I am safe from the gang. I live in a neighborhood where the gang is operational. And one of the ways in which to keep myself safe is to join them or to collaborate with them in some respect, or maybe to think that I'll keep myself maybe not safe, but maybe my brother's safe, or my sister and my family and all the rest. So I think there's a lot of different motivations that go into this. What I've heard over the years talking to gang members is that in places like El Salvador, for instance, they don't have to recruit. They have a pretty steady line of possible recruits kind of hovering on the edges. What I think we don't often take into account in a lot of these spaces, both in places like El Salvador and the United States, is how much violence is happening inside the home and how so many of these guys don't want to be in their house, and find themselves on the street, just a lot of time on the street for a lot of reasons, but very often because they have been subjected to violence in their home. And it could be, physical violence, or it could be sexual violence. So
it's a literal second family then, a literal surrogate family.
Absolutely. And again, going back to this social aspect, it is definitely their surrogate family. No question about it. And they all talk about it like that. It's a bit of a cliche, but I don't think it's far from the truth for them, in that core element. That family allows them to speak their own language. And in the book, I go through some of this, where you've got a Salvadoran migrant in a largely Mexican-American neighborhood, avoiding the way in which he would normally say the word you, just referring to you. He would use the word vos, but that immediately identified him as a Salvadoran. So he had to switch his language until he found the Salvadorans who were embracing that. And who were they? They were the MS-13. So, we don't necessarily think of these things, but I think they play a big role in drawing these groups of people together into this community.
Talk me through the full initiation procedure then. You've talked about this 13 seconds thing. I've also heard about some pretty disturbing stuff that women are supposed to have to do if they're going to get in, and then there's some other steps. How does it work?
Quick parentheses would be that women are no longer allowed into the MS-13. Sometime in the early 2000s, they made a kind of collective decision.
Patriarchy. Bloody patriarchy again. It is
the bloody patriarchy. And, yes, there were as far as female initiates, I spoke to a few of them. One of them is chronicled in my book. There is this sort of, there's kind of two avenues. You're either sexed in, where you have to have sex with multiple members of the gang, the clique in this case, or you're beaten in. So, the ones that I spoke to both said that they had been beaten into the gang, because if you're sexed in, then you're really never a member of the gang. Anyway, but in terms of the way in which you reach that stage, because there's really a long process, or there can be a long process before you reach the initiation stage where you're beaten in, and that differs depending upon geography. In places where you have a lot of potential recruits like El Salvador, that period, at least when I was doing the bulk of my research a couple of years ago, could last a couple of years. And that included sort of, starting you out doing very basic services, keeping an eye out, those sorts of things, maybe starting to messenger things back and forth. Maybe you're involved then into, you can see kind of it's sort of escalating. Maybe you're involved in sort of collecting for the money from extortion, those sorts of things. And it steadily escalates to the point where you're at a certain point required to, or at least asked to participate in a murder or two. There were differing stories about how many murders you had to commit in order to be part of the gang. There are periods, I would suppose, when you have to commit more murders rather than less. So I don't think it necessarily is sort of a hard and fast rule. And it's very much related to, again, geography. You don't necessarily get that same rule of having to commit one or more murders if you are being ushered into the gang in a space like the United States, which has far higher costs to being a violent gang than being a violent gang in a space like El Salvador. So there are kind of differing ways in, but it's sort of this sort of rising scale of activities till you reach the point where, okay, now you're going to be a member, they'll beat you in. But even after that, you have to continue to illustrate what they call commitment. And you do that very often by these collective, or participating in these collective expressions of violence. There's multiple members going after other rivals, basically. And again, not necessarily, and very often not even related to criminal economies. Just this illustration of group cohesion, just this illustration of we are the strongest. It kind of boggles the mind, but that's why that's another reason why they have never become this very sophisticated criminal organization, because they're really bad criminals. It comes down to that. And if you are managing a very sophisticated criminal organization, why would you align yourself with them? They're totally visible. They fall on the radar of law enforcement nonstop. They're all tattooed up. And they're really bad at what they do. And there's so many possible leaks of information. It just doesn't make sense on so many levels to align yourself with them. And then inside, they're just bad criminals. It's just, maybe it comes down to that.
Yeah, maybe. What about leaving? How hard is it to leave?
I think again, it varies from place to place. I think it's much harder to leave in spaces like El Salvador. It's a smaller space. The circles are smaller. Everybody knows each other, and it's difficult to leave in that area, which is why you get a lot of them applying for asylum in the United States, because they leave and they find they can't really leave, and even if they sort of go through the process, and there is a process whereby you are basically supposed to ask for permission.
How does that go?
Are given permission. So you get old, you have a family, you have a job, you have other responsibilities, and you can ask to leave, and you're given sort of permission, and you become basically what they call a calmado. You're calmed, you're retired. Now, here's the thing: you can be called out of retirement if you go through this way. Now, you can ask for another way to leave, which is you can say, I'm going to join the evangelical church. And then in that instance, if you do commit yourself for real to the evangelical church, you cannot be called out, or it's very unlikely you'll be called out of retirement in that case. If you show your commitment, you dedicate yourself to this other higher cause, which, by the way, has a lot of parallels with the gang life. Again, we don't think of it in that way, but there is a lot of parallels. And then the third way is you run out. You run away. That's the third way. You get out, you run, and you say, I'm not turning around, and they could be chasing you your whole life, which is the case I have in that kind of forms the spine of my book.
With Norman, yeah. What's the deal with the church thing? Do the gang respect religious faith so much that it supersedes their cohesion as a group?
I think that there is a respect for religion in the sense that you are devoted to a higher cause, like you are with the gang. So when you're in the gang, everything is about el barrio, right? This idea of community, which is sort of their word for community, el barrio, the neighborhood. And in the same way, they see that sort of interestingly in the evangelical church. They don't have the same appreciation or relationship with the Catholic Church. But with the evangelical churches, there are obviously many, many evangelical churches and strains. They have this acceptable avenue of escape. Again, as long as you dedicate and you illustrate that you are committed to that, and you don't stray away. You could say, I joined the evangelical church, and if they find you drinking and smoking and all this stuff, you could find yourself in deep trouble. So they have this relation, this reverence for that they don't have for the Catholic Church, and they allow that. And again, just going back just quickly about the similarities. Our sense from like an inside crime perspective and from a Steve Dudley perspective is that there is a lot of similarities in the structure of life. It's a very patriarchal system. Both are very patriarchal systems. Both occupy a huge amount of your time. So you're going to church every night, or you're going to, what they call meetings every night for the gang. You have this commitment again to this higher cause. It's about sort of group cohesion. There's a lot of solidarity in churches and obviously a lot of solidarity in the gangs. So anyway, all that to say that there's a lot of parallels.
I'm not surprised that they're not getting much crime done or much money made. They're too busy. They're constantly at meetings or in church singing hymns and stuff. I'd have no time to do anything at all. What's the story? Can you explain the story that Norman, your character, pseudonym character for a real person in the book, goes through, where he needs to prove there's a 50% or greater chance that he's going to be killed or tortured?
So he goes to the United States running from the gang.
He wanted to leave. Oh no, they wanted to make him a boss of some kind. Then he said, I don't want to do that. I'm going to leave. And they said, you're not. And he said, I am. And then he ran.
Yes. So he's escaping. He escapes one attempt on his life by the gang. And then the police nearly kill him as well. So he's got a lot of enemies. And the rival gang, the 18th Street, doesn't exactly like him either. So he's got a lot going on, and he's recently out of jail. Let's say, I guess he's a few years out of jail at that stage. And huge portions of the gang have been put in jail, leadership. And so they have holes in their leadership outside of jail. So they start calling him up, and he ignores their calls. There's only so long you can ignore the call of the Ranfla Histórica, right? Which is basically the leadership council is calling him up. So he runs, and his family comes in, kind of behind him. And his family hand themselves over to the United States authorities at the Texas border. He doesn't have that option. He can't, because of his gang affiliation, can't apply for asylum like his family members can. So he has another avenue that he can use in order to stay and get what's called relief from deportation from the United States. And it's called the Convention Against Torture. It's an international convention. One of the signatories is the United States. And basically it means that as a signatory, you have the obligation of evaluating whether or not a place where you would send somebody back to, deport somebody back to, would be so dangerous that they would face a greater than 50% chance of being tortured and or killed by the state. Okay, it has to be the state that would commit that crime, right? So in essence, the judge is evaluating whether or not the Salvadoran state, probably pretty specifically the police in this case, the Salvadoran police, would find and kill, or at least allow for others to kill, perhaps Norman in this case, inside a prison, inside the prison system, for example, or torture him, right? Is there a greater than 50% chance that that's going to happen? That's what the judge is evaluating. So that's why the part about him, narrowly escaping death at the hands of the police is so fundamental. And in that case, if the judge finds that, he is obliged, because the United States is a signatory to this international convention, to give him relief as long as that is the case. So that means that Norman, even though he eventually obtains relief under that convention, and he is a gang member too, which obviously this is the tension. You've got this admitted gang member who is at that point enemy number one of the Trump administration, applying for relief to stay in the United States. And he eventually gets it, but he still has to check in every year with United States authorities and say, hey, I'm here, I'm living here, you can find me here, blah, blah, blah. And at any point, the Attorney General of the United States could decide, you know what? We're done with Norman. He's going back. So he's still in a precarious position, but he did obtain relief. There are people who obtain CAT and stay the rest of their lives, CAT relief, and stay the rest of their lives in the United States. So it could happen with Norman as well.
That's terrifying. Not only do your enemies hate you, but your old friends hate you and they want to kill you as well. And then the people that are supposed to protect you from both of those groups, they also hate you and they're going to kill you. It's
yes,
it's crazy. You talk about in some gruesome detail the conditions of the prisons and the way that some of the experiences go through. Can you tell us some of the more extreme stories that you heard about the conditions in the prisons and what's going on there?
Well, I think it's important to consider that when the gangs, basically what happens is more and more gang members who had begun their lives in the gang in the United States get deported back to places like El Salvador in huge numbers. And that's what establishes the base for which the gang emerges in El Salvador, are these deportees. They then begin their operations, or they start doing their activities, many of them violent, in El Salvador, and they start to land in jail in El Salvador. And when they land in jail in El Salvador, this is the late 1990s, early 2000s, they are at the disadvantage. They are smaller in number than some of their rivals, including the rival gang, the 18th Street, but also the most powerful criminal prison gangs at the time. And those prison gangs are brutal in many respects. And perhaps the most brutal part of it is that they commit horrible acts of sexual violence against them. One of the first things that Norman sees when he is ushered into, I think it's the third jail.
The Mariona.
The Mariona, right? A super famous jail in El Salvador, and the biggest of all the jails in El Salvador, run by a brutal prison gang, is another MS-13 member. So Norman gets ushered into a cell, and in this cell he's in front of another member who's being raped right in front of him in this jail cell. That other member ends up dying of AIDS, according to AIDS-related illnesses, according to Norman. So this is his initiation into the jail. Of course, this is something that is, another point of cohesion of these particular criminal organizations, especially inside jail, is this risk of sexual assault. And so they almost immediately, begin to bind to each other. And they begin to form their own very strong presence inside the prison, enough so that they can confront this stronger prison gang, which is doing not just, rapes inside of those prisons, but is extorting them, is extorting their family members, is assaulting their family members, including sometimes sexual assault, is beating them openly, with the guards' support, because, there are these kind of informal pacts between guards and strong prison gangs. In a lot of ways, in a very perverse way, it kind of makes the prison guards' job easier if there is a one sort of master. Yes, exactly, self-enforcement. So I think you probably know all too well what I'm talking about. And so there's that aspect that's playing out. And you have the emergence of these other criminal prison gangs. One of them is the MS-13, to the point where the fighting begins, and then the fighting gets so bad that the government makes a strategic decision to begin to separate them. So the MS-13 goes to one prison, or they actually control like 2 or 3 prisons, and then the 18th Street goes to another prison, which gives them de facto control, total control over those prisons, and basically gives them an operational headquarters in many respects. So you can see the logic behind it. It's an effort to slow the violence, but the sort of ripple effects thereafter they didn't foresee.
It's so you damned if you do and damned if you don't in that situation. They're committing crime out on the streets. They're killing each other if they're in jail. And then if you do the only option which is left to kind of segregate jails based on gangs, then you essentially end up with a paid-for headquarters. And it seems like most of those jails are kind of fairly hands-off for the guards. I saw Ross Kemp in an MS-13 run jail. Pretty terrible conditions. They're talking about how all of their homies have all got diarrhea and stomach upsets, and it's really dirty, and there's people hanging from hammocks, and like 20 people per cell, 30 people per cell. It's absolutely packed, but at least they're safe from their enemies, right? And the guards just kind of, the guards take Ross up to basically the front gate, and then they're like, right, okay, now we're going to hand you over to the guy that runs this, but the guy that runs this isn't some commissioner from the prison, it's the head inmate.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, I have never been in an MS-13 controlled jail in El Salvador, but I went into an 18th Street one, and it was the exact same experience. The guards open the door and then close the door behind you, and then that's the space you're in.
That's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it is a strange feeling, and they're living in horrible
squalor.
Conditions. I mean, yeah, it's squalor. One hammock above the other, and sleeping over the toilet, and it's not fun either. So, no, the prison question is, I think, a sort of forgotten element of this. And, going back to the Mexican Mafia, even their operational style in the U.S. and many other prison gangs that are operating in the U.S., we just think that we can, lock them up and throw away the key and we're done with it. And it's just so not the case. And I just don't know when we're going to come around to that realization. Maybe never.
What were the authorities in El Salvador trying to do to crack down on this? Because it's going to just become a war in the streets if you send the cops in. I've seen videos, I think it might have been Ross Kemp or maybe a Vice News documentary I watched today about MS-13, where they use raids as an opportunity that's almost like a PR stunt to give this show of force to anybody that's nearby in the neighborhood. So they'll send 250 special forces and armed soldiers in to take down a relatively small number of people, but it just seems like that's a mess. And then they were jailing people for just having affiliation tattoos and clothing and colors of clothing at one point. It seems like a mess.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the legislation around dealing with gangs really emerged in California in the 1980s when they were dealing with this epicenter of gang activity in the United States. The place where the MS-13 was born had about 400 gangs operational in that area. And what they did was they created special units of the type that you're talking about, the most famous of which in Los Angeles was called Crash, which included the word hoodlum in it. in the acronym, which is, something you wouldn't necessarily get in a sort of special unit these days. So you had that, and they would do very similar style operations, very much kick the door down, flashy type of things, and sort of bring them all in jail. Well, we know what happened to them in jail. They became part of the Sureños and part of a larger network, were deported back down, et cetera, et cetera. We know that part of the story. But parallel to that, they're also creating databases, and those databases have all kinds of problems associated with them, since they're, it's very much a kind of the criteria upon which you are included in those databases are very flimsy, to say the least. There was a database, the most famous database, which was one of the first in California, and an analysis of that in 2014, I believe. There were a couple of 4-year-olds that were on the database, a gang database. So it's that sort of thing. And then they create legislation which allows them to enhance penalties, sentences. And the legislation has, and this is perhaps the original sin that you were referring to earlier, a notion of gangs, which they essentially copy pasted from the United Nations definition of organized crime. But if you take my word for it, they're not organized crime.
Unorganized crime.
If you are going to start, if that's your premise upon which you are building out legislation, then we're in trouble. And not just that, but over the years, all of the states have developed their own laws regarding the gangs, and there's no single definition of what a gang is. There are, and we counted these when we were doing a report at Insight Crime, there were 40 out of 50 states plus DC, there were, plus the District of Columbia, there were 44 different definitions of gang, plus DC's definition of gang. So 45 out of 51 of these jurisdictions had different definitions of what a gang was. So where are we going with all this? It eventually, not only is it sort of replicated in mass in the United States, but we export that same model to places like El Salvador. And what do they start doing? They start arresting them for the same flimsy style reasons. They start creating databases. They start overpopulating their jails. And lo and behold, they have not just the same problems, in many regards, much worse problems. And why are we surprised? I mean, for me, it's kind of baffling how we turn away from what the story tells us, what the data tells us, what we can prove empirically about what works, and maybe more importantly, what definitely does not work. So, I mean, this is kind of the lesson that we see over and over again. And then we're surprised that this gang has been around for 40 years. Why are we surprised when we keep doing the same thing as it relates to them? I'm not saying it's easy to wipe out any gang, but we can certainly mitigate them with much more effective policies that are much broader in scope than simply thinking about it in a punitive way.
I put Stephen Dudley in charge. I say, right, you've got the resources at your disposal. What do you do?
Look, I think you can't. I'm not going to get rid of the law enforcement component. That's already there. That has its own inertia. Who's going to fight that battle? Nobody, right? But you're
already talking like a politician.
You have to exactly. I've already backtracked. Exactly. I've already swallowed all of what I just said 5 minutes ago. No, the middle section of this is what do we do? Now for the people who could be potentially brought into these organizations, these communities, I think we need to work more on, creating alternative communities, right? We need to create competing communities, things that can compete with what the gang gives them. And that includes everything from thinking about how do we protect people, to how do we involve them, to how do we make sure that they're crossing their interests with other people's interests and, like-minded interests. And maybe that includes nationality and ethnicity and race and all that other stuff. I think we need to think about all these things. And when we create these alternative spaces, one of these alternative or de facto alternative spaces are the church. And we need to study why is the questions that you were asking me earlier. Why is the evangelical church? Why is that even acceptable to them. That's a competing community, you know? And so that's the type of thing I think we need to think about in the sort of medium term, is how to create these competing communities. And then in the very, very long term, we need to think about how you deal with violence, particularly violence in the home. So we don't put near enough resources towards early family intervention. And I'm talking about dealing with, families that have a lot of situations of abuse, physical and sexual abuse in particular. So hyper focus on that, because what we know about people who end up in jail is that a huge portion of them were abused in their home. So this is something we need to consider when we're considering, long term, how are we changing the way people sort of approach or interact with other human beings. So I think there's a lot of different things. The sort of immediate term is, certainly we have to deal with the problems that gangs pose, and much of those problems are related to law enforcement. We have to deal with the issues in terms of, the way in which they've created this very attractive and obviously, antisocial, but very much attractive community. And we have to deal with the problems, the sort of core root problems that happen inside the home, that very often lead people to join those spaces.
It's interesting. It's not an easy task, sadly. And this is why every time that I get exposed to work like yours or Sean Atwood's true crime podcast, he's a big podcaster in the UK, often has a lot of guys from ex-gang affiliations on there. Whenever I listen to that, I think, God, this is such a big behemoth, such a leviathan of a problem to try and fix. And then when you hear politicians that come on and throw buzzwords like tough on crime or crack down on criminals, you think, what does that even mean? It's so long. This isn't a task that even the president that gets into office next time the next term is going to fix. This is the thing that aims to be fixed in 50 years or so. What are your predictions moving forward? The future of El Salvador. Obviously, we've seen this decline in murder rate, but that could be the gangs basically fettling the figures. What do you think we'll see over the next decade or so from MS-13?
I fear a little bit the next decade, in one respect, in that I do see the beginnings of kind of an evolution of the MS-13 in a way that I hadn't seen.
This is more sophisticated criminal enterprise.
They're becoming more sophisticated.
Leveling up.
They're leveling up. They're getting more sophisticated. They're beginning to understand in a way they hadn't shown before on both a criminal level. So their understanding of how to deal with excess resources, put those resources to work, get involved in other types of economic activities. So more legitimate businesses, money laundering activities, which shows you a sort of an element of how much they're accumulating as well. And also on a political level, they're understanding where their leverage points are and how to pull those levers. I mean, that's what they're really getting when they're interacting with these governments, is they know when to pull these levers. They know how to, create the effective communications channels and, send the messages that they want and get what they want. So anyway, we're seeing that. So I fear it a little bit in that respect. On another level, I say to myself, you know what? This is how criminals become legitimate parts of society. No matter what country, every single criminal group, whether we're talking about the, Irish Mafia or the Italian Mafia or any other sort of criminal group, is they become sophisticated and they, over time, pieces of them or their sort of generations below them become legitimate, and this is how it works, because there are not these sort of traditional avenues of moving up the social ladder. How else do we expect them to, become part of legitimate society other than criminal activities. And it's not limited to gangs, but I feel like the gang, mostly we're talking about El Salvador, is beginning to kind of see that. It's kind of crystallizing in front of them in El Salvador. I wouldn't be surprised if 10 years from now we have a much different MS-13 just in El Salvador. I don't think maybe parts of Honduras, but just in El Salvador. And if not an MS-13, cliques. I like to talk about gangs within a gang. The gang is so big. These cliques are so big. Some of these cliques have thousands of members themselves, and they're operational on an international scale. And because my loyalty is very often with my clique, these cliques could evolve into criminal organizations in and of themselves, much more sophisticated. So that's kind of what I see as a possibility. But on the other hand, I say maybe this is the process whereby they become part of legitimate society, less violence. Certainly illicit proceeds will tilt the playing field in their favor on the economic grounds, on political grounds. That's not fair. But criminal groups do this all the time. And they've done this all the time throughout history. So we should not be surprised if that's the path that they're beginning to take. And maybe we shouldn't get in their way. I mean, maybe we'll hasten their arrival to legitimate society. We'll lower the amount of carnage, extortion, murders, forced recruitment, rape, everything else that is related to, the activities of this gang. And they are numerous. And so maybe if we hasten that trip, maybe we might be better off, because we're certainly not doing anything to slow down the other. 40 years, same numbers, at least the same numbers, if not more, greater presence in more countries now. What are we doing? We're not doing much to mitigate what they are. So we need to rethink this, maybe. I don't know. I'm getting lost in my own thoughts right now.
Man, that's a tough pill to swallow, that permitting them to act more effectively as criminals is the most expedient way to get them out of the worst types of criminality that we want to get rid of. Yeah, it's do you know what it is? I actually think it's I'm unsure whether it's true, and I'm glad I'm not in the position to have to make the call. But there's part of me that does make sense, and it comes back to what you said at the very beginning about them being this sort of hand-to-mouth organization. Part of what makes them feel quite jarring to, I think, me when I think about it, and probably a lot of the listeners as well, is this level of poverty around them. It makes you think kind of like the Rwandan genocide. They even use machetes as well, right? It's this sort of low-grade, low-rent, unsophisticated, wanton violence. And I would imagine that when there aren't these opportunities, if you've got enough money for a car and a house and a mansion and these sort of things, you're not bothered about running around just killing people over petty turf wars, because you have bigger things on your mind. I guess the inevitability of the criminal enterprise is that there's a lot of operations that need to be looked after that take time away from being on the street doing stuff. I wanted to ask you this story as well that I heard last year. I can't remember if it was in Brazil or Venezuela or somewhere else. Someone was trying to enact, or someone refused to enact, a 6 p.m. curfew for COVID. And the gang made a public statement and said, if the government won't act, we will. And they enforced a COVID curfew. And that story stuck with me while I was reading your book, because it made me think, oddly, and you hear these stories about, I don't know whether it was El Chapo or another one of the sort of big Mexican cartels who would go and give money to people. They would fund schools. They'd have roads and things named after them. I'm aware that there are better saints to put on a pedestal. But my point is that as the gangs become more sophisticated, they actually integrate themselves into life in a more productive way. Yes, sure, they're still extorting people and doing all of these bad things, but it really does feel like, Seth Godin's The Dip, that kind of, the area where you have real lack of capacity to do stuff. It feels like MS-13s in that. It feels like they haven't got the resources to integrate and get any of the good things. Look at me talking about the good things of criminal enterprises. Haven't got any of the advantages that come with a sophisticated criminal organization, but they have all of the aggression and the members and the free time in the world and the enemies to have these territory wars.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I guess, kind of how do we change the equation, and who are we changing the equation for? I think there are a lot of different, when we talk about the gang, we think about sort of one sort of narrow strip of population, but really, most we're talking about like kids from, kids, I say young adults, 18 to 25, right? That's your gang strip right there. So that's your kind of target, but maybe that's not the right target. I mean, I don't know. It's so hard to say where to put the emphasis, but I think in your description of it, what I think about is, how do we change the calculation? And if you can change the calculation from, it's in my interest to send 4 guys out with machetes after this guy, and it doesn't even mean that I'm going to, win that drug corner. It has nothing to do with that. It's just because he's the other gang. If I can start by changing that equation, that it's not in my interest to do that, then we're moving in the right direction. And of course that is like the lowest bar. I mean,
stop chopping people up. Stop chopping people up. That's the first thing we wanted to have happen.
Exactly. Stop making that be a rewarding experience. Why is that a rewarding experience? And part of that, of course, going back, that part of that is a law enforcement equation, but part of that is sort of shifting the direction of where they could be putting their energies. It's an incredibly difficult question to answer in the whole, right? But I think that there's so many resources that are already in place that can answer it on the micro level. That I think a lot of it is just trying to sort of figure out where to harness the existing resources that are already at play. I don't think we need any extra resources in that regard. I don't know. We're trying to solve the gang problem here in an hour-long podcast. It's a tough one.
Rightly so. If there are 2 men on this planet to do it, Stephen, it's me and you. Stephen Dudley, ladies and gentlemen, people want to check out more of your stuff. Where should they go?
You can go to stephendudley.com, or you can go to insightcrime.org. That's the organization that I co-direct. And we cover organized crime in the Americas. So have a look.
Thank you very much, man. I appreciate your time. MS-13, the making of America's most notorious gang, will be linked in the show notes below as well. Cheers, man.
Thank you very much, Chris, for having me.
Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that, then press here for a selection of the best clips from the podcast over the last few months. And don't forget to subscribe. It makes me very happy indeed. Peace.